35 years old, and 5 weeks ago, at a packed HOA community meeting in the clubhouse of our neighborhood, our board president, Marlene Whitcomb, held up photos of my front garden on a projector screen and told nearly 60 of my neighbors that I was a repeat violator who clearly thinks the rules don't apply to her, levying a $500 monthly fine for what she called unauthorized landscaping in violation of community aesthetic standards. She didn't know that 6 weeks earlier, my company had quietly won the contract to manage her HOA's entire property management operations, and that her own board's monthly management fees were now, indirectly, being paid to me. I didn't say anything at that meeting. I sat in the third row, took notes on my phone, and let Marlene finish her presentation. I already knew what was sitting in a signed contract in my office, and I knew, better than anyone else in that room, exactly how much authority she actually had left to enforce anything at all. To understand why I stayed so quiet through that meeting, you need to go back 8 months, to the week I started a small property management consulting company, with absolutely no intention of it ever colliding with my own neighborhood's homeowners association. Before I get into it, if you're new here, take a second to subscribe to The Quiet Reckoning. It genuinely helps this channel grow. Drop the word overruled in the comments if you've ever watched someone with a little bit of power use it in a way they never expected to be held accountable for. I read every comment. Now let me take you back to where this actually started, because you need the full picture before any of what happened at that meeting makes sense. I bought my house in Cedar Hollow, a mid-sized planned community outside Austin, Texas, 4 years ago, drawn by the neighborhood's mature trees and reasonable prices compared to the newer developments springing up around the city. I remember walking the neighborhood for the first time with my realtor, genuinely charmed by the century oak in what would become my own front yard, a tree old enough to have shaded 3 previous owners of the same modest brick ranch house. Cedar Hollow, like most planned communities of its size, operates under a homeowners association responsible for maintaining shared amenities, enforcing community aesthetic standards, and managing a modest annual budget funded by resident dues. For most of my time living there, the HOA operated the way these things typically do: mildly bureaucratic, occasionally frustrating over small things, like mailbox paint colors or trash can visibility, but generally unremarkable, the kind of low-grade administrative presence most residents barely think about between the occasional newsletter and annual dues notice. That changed about 1.5 years ago when Marlene Whitcomb was elected board president after a contentious community vote following the previous president's resignation. Marlene, a retired corporate compliance officer, brought an intensity to the role that quickly became the subject of neighborhood conversation, implementing a stricter, more aggressively enforced set of aesthetic guidelines than the community had previously operated under, with a particular, almost personal focus, I came to realize, on landscaping choices that deviated from traditional lawn and shrub arrangements. Longtime residents told me more than once that the HOA under previous leadership had rarely issued more than a handful of violation notices per year across the entire community. Under Marlene, that number climbed into the dozens within her first 6 months alone. My front garden had become, over the 2 years before Marlene's presidency, something I was genuinely proud of. A xeriscaped, drought-tolerant design featuring native Texas plants, ornamental grasses, and a small gravel pathway, a choice I'd made deliberately after watching my water bill and my neighbor's traditional lawn struggle through 2 consecutive brutal summer droughts that turned half the neighborhood's grass a uniform, defeated brown by August. I'd spent an entire spring researching native plant species with a local nursery owner, genuinely excited about creating something both beautiful and sustainable, a small act of environmental responsibility I felt proud of every time I pulled into my own driveway. I'd actually submitted the design for approval through the HOA's standard architectural review process before installing it, receiving written approval from the board at the time, well before Marlene's tenure began, a document I'd kept carefully filed away, never imagining I'd need it as evidence years later. Marlene's aggressive enforcement campaign began targeting my garden specifically about 10 months ago, roughly 4 months into her presidency, despite the original approval on file. Her first letter cited a vague provision about community aesthetic consistency, suggesting my garden, while technically approved years earlier, no longer aligned with updated community standards she was in the process of formalizing. I responded calmly, providing the original approval documentation and requesting clarification about what specific standards had changed. Her response, rather than addressing the documentation directly, escalated to a formal violation notice and the beginning of what became a genuinely exhausting months-long pattern of monthly inspection letters, escalating fines, and eventually the public presentation at that community meeting 5 weeks ago. I want to be honest that I don't fully understand why Marlene fixated on my property specifically, among the dozen or so homes in Cedar Hollow with some variation of non-traditional landscaping. A neighbor mentioned at one point that Marlene had made an offhand comment at an earlier board meeting about certain newer residents thinking they can redefine what this community looks like. A comment that felt to several longtime residents pointed toward the small but growing number of younger homeowners who'd moved into Cedar Hollow in recent years and brought different aesthetic preferences with them. Whatever the underlying motivation, the practical effect was months of genuinely stressful, expensive conflict over a garden that had been properly approved through the community's own official process. While all of this was unfolding in my personal life, an entirely separate professional development was taking shape that I never anticipated would intersect with it. I'd left a corporate real estate position 2 years earlier to start my own consulting firm, Ferraro Property Solutions, specializing in operational efficiency reviews and management services for homeowners associations and small commercial properties across the greater Austin area. It's unglamorous, detail-oriented work, reviewing vendor contracts, streamlining maintenance scheduling, identifying budget inefficiencies, the kind of behind-the-scenes operational work that most residents of any HOA never think about or interact with directly, since it typically happens at the level of the community's contracted management company rather than the volunteer board itself. 8 months ago, my firm submitted a competitive bid for a contract to take over property management services for a regional portfolio of HOA communities, whose previous management company had lost its contract after years of resident complaints about slow response times and poor financial transparency. Cedar Hollow, I want to be honest, wasn't a community I specifically targeted or even fully registered as part of the broader portfolio during the bidding process. My firm bid on the regional contract as a package deal covering 11 different communities managed under the same umbrella company. Cedar Hollow, simply one name among many on a spreadsheet I reviewed during due diligence. Not a community I connected in the moment to my own home address, since I'd submitted the bid under my company's name rather than any personal identifying information tied to my residency. My firm won that regional contract 6 weeks before that community meeting. A genuinely professional achievement I was proud of, representing the largest single contract Ferraro Property Solutions had secured since I started the company. It wasn't until my operations manager, reviewing the incoming client roster during onboarding, mentioned casually that Cedar Hollow was among the communities transitioning to our management, that I realized with a strange jolt that my own neighborhood's HOA had just become, professionally, my client. I want to explain the specific ethical position I found myself in because I think it matters for understanding what I did next. As the incoming management company, my firm would be handling Cedar Hollow's day-to-day administrative and financial operations, vendor contracts, budget administration, dues collection, but critically, would have no authority over and no direct involvement in the volunteer board's actual policy decisions and enforcement actions, including Marlene's specific campaign against my garden. Property management companies contractually typically implement board decisions rather than making them, a structural separation I clearly and had no intention of blurring, regardless of how directly Marlene's ongoing fines affected me personally. I disclosed the conflict of interest immediately and thoroughly, both to my own operations team and through proper channels to Cedar Hollow's board itself, informing them in writing that as a resident currently navigating an active dispute with the board, I would have zero personal involvement in any account management, correspondence, or decision-making related to Cedar Hollow specifically, delegating that entire relationship to my operations manager, Devin, and recusing myself completely from anything touching my own community, exactly the same standard I'd apply to any conflict of interest in professional consulting work. What I didn't do in those 6 weeks between winning the contract and that community meeting was tell Marlene directly or correct the ongoing garden dispute using any leverage related to the management contract, because doing so would have violated the exact ethical boundary I'd just established. I continued responding to her escalating fines through the normal resident dispute process, the same process available to any Cedar Hollow homeowner, while my firm, entirely separately, began the standard operational transition work for the community's management services, handled exclusively by my team without my direct involvement. That community meeting 5 weeks ago happened to fall during the transition period, an already scheduled meeting where Marlene had planned, apparently for some time, to present my garden dispute publicly as what she described as an example of the accountability this board is committed to. I sat in the third row, having received the same meeting notice as every other resident, genuinely unaware, walking in, that this particular meeting would also include a brief operational update from the incoming management company about the transition timeline, a routine agenda item scheduled well before Marlene's garden presentation. Marlene's presentation happened first. She projected photos of my garden alongside photos of neighboring traditional lawns, describing at length the pattern of noncompliance she'd documented over 10 months, and announcing the formal $500 fine to the assembled residents, several of whom I could see exchanging uncomfortable glances, aware, as most of my closer neighbors were, that my garden had been properly approved years earlier. She spoke for nearly 15 minutes, methodical in the way I imagine she'd once presented compliance reports in her corporate career, walking through a timeline of inspection dates and photographic evidence with the practiced confidence of someone who clearly rehearsed this presentation more than once. I sat through it with the specific, practiced calm I'd developed over 10 months of this exact conflict, watching my own front yard displayed like evidence on a screen 12 feet wide, while beside me a longtime neighbor named Priya reached over and squeezed my hand briefly, a small, silent gesture of solidarity that meant more to me than she probably realized in the moment. The operational trend came next on the agenda, delivered not by me, but by Devin, my operations manager, who'd handled the entire Cedar Hollow relationship exactly as I'd instructed. He introduced Ferraro Property Solutions as the community's new management company, outlined the transition timeline in clear professional terms, and mentioned in the ordinary course of a standard introduction that the firm was locally owned and operated, founded by Bianca Ferraro, a longtime Austin resident with a background in commercial and residential property operations. He gestured casually toward where I was sitting, apparently assuming reasonably that most of the room already knew who I was, since I'd lived in Cedar hollow for 4 years and had, ironically, been the subject of the room's attention for the previous 15 minutes for an entirely different reason. I want to describe Marlene's face in that moment because I think it matters. It wasn't immediate. It took several seconds for the connection to visibly land, her eyes moving from Devin to me, then to the projector screen still displaying photos of my garden, then back to me, a slow, unmistakable recalculation happening in real time in front of nearly 60 residents. My neighbor Priya, beside me, let out a small, surprised laugh she quickly stifled behind her hand. A ripple of quiet murmuring moved through the room as other residents made the same connection at slight heads turning. A few audible whispers I couldn't quite make out but could easily guess the content of. Marlene recovered quickly, professionally, the way I imagine a former corporate